The wind howled through the pines as Thomas knelt in the snow, his heart stopping at what lay before him. A child, no more than 5 or 6, nearly buried in white, skin blue, eyes closed. Death approaching with every passing second. "Please," he whispered, gathering the tiny form against his chest. "Don't give up now." As the blizzard raged around them, he had no way of knowing this half-frozen girl would shatter his carefully constructed isolation and force him to confront the life and love he'd abandoned 5 years ago. Hidden away in the Alaskan wilderness, he found a half-frozen girl in the snow. Before we begin this emotional story, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I'd love to give your comment a heart. Now let's begin this moving story. The windswept peaks of Alaska's northern range stood sentinel, watching over Thomas Grant's small cabin like ancient, indifferent gods. At 36, Thomas had already lived several lifetimes of suffering. The face that stared back at him from his cracked bathroom mirror each morning was weathered beyond its years. Eyes that had seen too much, lines etched by grief rather than age. 5 years ago, he'd had everything. A promising career as a wildlife photographer, a beautiful partner named Sarah, and a future as bright as the Alaskan summer sky. Now, all that remained was Wolf, the Malamute shepherd mix he'd rescued from a hunter's trap 4 winters ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. 2 wounded souls, finding each other in the wilderness. "What do you say, boy? Ready for today's patrol?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from disuse. Wolf's ears perked up, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, reflecting an intelligence that sometimes unnerved visitors to the reserve. Not that they had many visitors, especially not in winter, when temperatures plummeted to -40 and the darkness seemed eternal. Thomas pulled on his heavy parka, checked his emergency supplies, and stepped out into the biting cold. The Forest Service badge on his chest felt like it weighed nothing compared to the invisible burdens he carried. The weight of false accusations, the 3 years in prison for a wildlife trafficking crime he didn't commit, the news of his mother's death that came while he was behind bars, and Sarah's disappearance from his life without even a goodbye. The vast whiteness stretched before them, untouched except for the winding path they'd made on previous patrols. Here, among the towering pines and ancient spruce, Thomas had found a semblance of peace. The wilderness didn't judge. It simply existed, harsh but honest. Unlike people, unlike the justice system, unlike life. Little did Thomas know that today's patrol would change everything. That in the unforgiving wilderness that had become his sanctuary, he would find something that would shatter his carefully constructed isolation and force him to confront the world he'd left behind. The first sign was barely noticeable, small indentations in the fresh snow, too delicate to belong to any of the usual wildlife. Wolf noticed them first, his posture changing subtly as his nose dipped to the snow. Thomas might have missed them entirely if not for his companion's sudden alertness. "What is it, boy?" Thomas knelt down, running his gloved finger along the edge of the impression, too small for an adult, too regular for an animal. A child's footprints? Out here, miles from the nearest settlement? His heart quickened. Children didn't venture this far into the reserve, especially not in winter. Something was wrong. Wolf whined, softly, already moving forward, following the trail with the determination of a creature who understood the stakes. Thomas followed, his trained eyes now picking up what he'd initially missed. The erratic pattern, the deepening impressions suggesting fatigue, the occasional handprint where someone small had stumbled and caught themselves. Then he saw it, crude letters etched into the snow beside a fallen log. "Find me, Mama." A cold that had nothing to do with the Alaskan winter seeped into Thomas's bones. Somewhere ahead was a lost child, alone in temperatures that could kill an adult in hours. "Find them, Wolf. Find them now," he urged, his voice cracking with sudden emotion. They moved faster, following the increasingly unsteady trail until Wolf suddenly darted forward, barking with urgency. Thomas broke into a run, his breath clouding before him, heart pounding against his ribs. Wolf had stopped at what appeared to be a small mound of snow beneath a spruce tree. But as Thomas approached, he realized with horror that the mound had the shape of a small human form, nearly covered by the relentlessly falling snow. With trembling hands, Thomas brushed away the white powder to reveal a child's face. A little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, her lips blue, eyelashes frosted, skin pale as the snow around her. For one terrible moment, he thought he was too late. Then, almost imperceptibly, her chest rose and fell. "Oh my God," Thomas whispered, immediately pulling off his outer jacket to wrap around her tiny body. "Hey, little one, can you hear me? I've got you now. I've got you." The girl didn't respond, but another shallow breath confirmed she was still fighting. Thomas checked quickly for injuries, finding none immediately visible, though her skin was dangerously cold. Hypothermia had set in, but how long ago he couldn't tell. As he gently lifted her, something fell from her jacket. A small, laminated card attached to the inside of her collar. Through the frost, he could make out a name. Emily Keller. "Emily," he said softly, tucking her securely against his chest. "Hold on, Emily. I'm taking you home." The wind had picked up, snow now falling in sideways sheets that stung his exposed face. The weather was turning, a blizzard approaching. The journey back to his cabin, easily navigable an hour ago, would now be a desperate race against time and elements. With Wolf leading the way and the semi-conscious child cradled in his arms, Thomas turned toward home, each step a prayer that he hadn't found this little girl, only to lose her to the merciless Alaskan winter. The cabin's warmth enveloped them as Thomas kicked the door shut behind him, the howling wind immediately muffled by the thick logs. Wolf shook vigorously, sending snow flying across the wooden floor, then rushed to his bed by the fireplace, watching intently as Thomas carried Emily to the couch. "Okay, little one. Let's get you warmed up," Thomas murmured. Years of wilderness, survival training kicking in. He knew the dangers of rewarming too quickly. With methodical care, he removed Emily's wet outer clothes, wrapped her in dry blankets, and positioned her near, but not too near, the crackling fire. Her breathing remained shallow, but her pulse, when he checked it, was steady. A fighter. Then, good. While preparing warm broth, Thomas called the nearest medical outpost on his satellite phone, only to learn that the incoming blizzard had already made helicopter evacuation impossible. They were on their own for at least 24 hours. Keep her warm, hydrated if possible, and monitor for any changes, the doctor instructed. Call back immediately if her condition worsens. Throughout the night, Thomas kept vigil, applying warm compresses to her core as instructed, speaking softly to her, even though she remained unconscious. Wolf never left his post beside the couch, occasionally nudging Emily's blanket-wrapped form with his nose, as if checking on her himself. By morning, color had returned to her cheeks, and her breathing had deepened and regulated. As the first gray light filtered through the cabin's windows, her eyelids fluttered open, revealing deep brown eyes that immediately widened with fear. "Hey there," Thomas said gently, keeping his distance to avoid frightening her further. "You're safe. My name is Thomas. This is Wolf. We found you in the snow. Do you remember being in the snow, Emily?" At the sound of her name, the girl's eyebrows drew together in confusion. She looked around the cabin, then back to Thomas, her expression wary but not panicked. Still, she didn't speak. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" Thomas offered her a cup of warm broth. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, her small hands trembling slightly. Throughout that day, Thomas tried various approaches to get Emily to speak. Gentle questions, showing her maps of the area, even playfully introducing her to Wolf's tricks. The child watched everything with intelligent, cautious eyes, but remained silent. It wasn't until Thomas absent-mindedly left his sketchbook on the table that something changed. Emily picked it up, flipped through his wildlife drawings, then looked up at him expectantly. Understanding dawned. Thomas placed a pencil before her. With surprising dexterity for her age, Emily began to draw. First, a helicopter. Then, several people. One figure, clearly a woman with long hair, had a star next to her. Finally, Emily drew a dramatic downward arrow from the helicopter and a single figure, herself, drifting away from the others. "You fell from a helicopter?" Thomas asked, his voice hushed with the realization. "Was this woman your mother?" Emily nodded, the first direct response she'd given him. "What's her name, Emily? Can you write her name?" The girl stared at the paper for a long moment, then carefully wrote 4 letters. Sarah. Thomas's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he stared at the name. It couldn't be. The coincidence would be too cruel, too impossible. But Alaska was sparsely populated, and how many Sarahs would be flying in helicopters with their daughters named Emily? With shaking hands, he found the laminated ID card from her jacket. There it was, in full. Emily Keller, Sarah's surname. 5 years ago, when he was arrested, Sarah had disappeared from his life entirely. No visits, no letters, not even a proper goodbye. Had she been pregnant when she left? Could this silent child with intelligent eyes be? Thomas pushed the impossible thought away. First, he needed to get Emily to safety, to find her mother, whoever she was. The personal revelations that threatened to overwhelm him would have to wait. The blizzard raged for 2 days, trapping them in the cabin. During that time, Thomas learned to read Emily's expressions, to understand her needs through gestures and drawings. What emerged was a portrait of a remarkably resilient child. Though she wouldn't, or couldn't, speak, her intelligence shone through in every interaction. She'd taken to Wolf immediately, the massive dog becoming her constant companion, sleeping at the foot of the bed Thomas had given her, following her around the small cabin like an attentive shadow. For his part, Thomas found himself slipping easily into the role of caretaker, surprising himself with knowledge he didn't know he possessed. How to make pancakes in the shape of animals, how to fashion a makeshift doll from pine cones and scraps of fabric, how to braid hair so it wouldn't tangle in the night. By the morning of the 3rd day, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed world outside, pristine, blindingly white, and dangerously cold. But the skies were clear, which meant they could finally make the journey to Fort Krestoff, the small community 15 miles south that housed the nearest medical facility. "We're going to take a little trip today," Thomas explained, as he helped Emily into the layers of clothing he'd improvised for her. Her own snowsuit, though good quality, had been soaked through during her ordeal. "We need to get you checked by a doctor, and then we'll work on finding your mother." At the mention of her mother, Emily's eyes lit up, and she nodded vigorously. The journey would be arduous, too far for Emily to walk in these conditions, despite her apparent recovery. Thomas had prepared his emergency sled, originally designed, to transport injured wildlife or supplies. With extra blankets and Wolf's warm body beside her, Emily would be protected from the worst of the cold. As they set out, Thomas couldn't help but notice how the burden of pulling the sled felt lighter than he expected. Perhaps it was the purpose driving him forward. For the first time in years, someone needed him. The thought was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The frozen landscape unfolded before them, beautiful and deadly. Thomas pointed out animal tracks to Emily, whose attentiveness never wavered despite the monotony of white fields and dark pines. Twice they spotted moose in the distance, and once, the fleeting shadow of a wolf pack moving parallel to their path. Curious, but keeping their distance from Wolf's territorial growls. By mid-afternoon, the smoke from Fort Krestoff's chimneys became visible on the horizon. Thomas felt Emily's small hand grasp his arm, her face suddenly anxious. "It's okay," he reassured her. "These are good people. They'll help us find your mom." The tiny settlement, really just a collection of hardy buildings clustered around a central meeting hall, seemed to materialize from the white emptiness. Dogs barked, announcing their arrival, and soon figures emerged from various doorways. "Thomas Grant? That really you?" a gruff voice called out. Jack Morrison, the settlement's unofficial leader, trudged toward them, his bushy beard covered in frost. "Been a while since you came down from that mountain of yours. And who's this?" Before Thomas could answer, an elderly woman pushed past. Jack, her sharp eyes taking in Emily's condition with a medical professional's precision. "Bring her inside, right now," Martha Stevens commanded, already turning back toward the clinic building. At 75, Martha had been a frontier nurse for over 50 years and brooked no argument when it came to matters of health. Within minutes, Emily was inside the warm clinic, being examined by Martha, while Thomas explained the circumstances of finding her to Jack and the gathering crowd of curious residents. "A helicopter crash?" Jack's eyebrows rose. "Come to think of it, we did get word about a research team that went down about 30 miles north of here, 3 days ago. Search and rescue found most of them, took them to Anchorage Medical." "Any casualties?" Thomas asked, his throat suddenly dry. "1 dead, 3 injured. Don't know names." Jack scratched his beard thoughtfully. "One was a photographer, I remember that much. Environmental research team, studying something about climate change impacts." Thomas's heart pounded painfully against his ribs. A photographer. Sarah had been pursuing environmental photography when he knew her. The coincidence was becoming harder to dismiss. Martha emerged from the examination room, her face unreadable. "She's in remarkably good shape, considering," the old woman announced. "No frostbite, though she was certainly close." "You got to her in time, Thomas." Her eyes softened slightly. "She still won't speak?" Thomas shook his head. "Not a word, but she communicates through drawing." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Traumatic. Mutism. I've seen it before, especially in children. The mind protects itself how it can." She glanced back toward the room where Emily now sat, drinking hot chocolate. "She wants you, by the way. Won't let anyone near her unless you're there," as Thomas moved to join Emily. Martha touched his arm, stopping him. "There's something else. I checked that ID tag you found, made some calls. Her full name is Emily Keller, daughter of Sarah Keller. Sarah survived the crash. She's at Anchorage Medical Center now." The name hung in the air between them. Martha, who had known Thomas since before his imprisonment, who had been one of the few to stand by him during his darkest days, watched his face carefully. "Thomas," she said softly, "is there something you're not telling me about this child?" In the quiet back room of Martha's clinic, Emily had fallen asleep, exhausted from the journey and the examinations. Thomas sat beside her, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, his mind racing with possibilities he dared not fully articulate, even to himself. "She'd be about the right age," Martha said from the doorway, her voice low to avoid waking the child. The old woman entered, closing the door softly behind her. 5, nearly 6. You've been gone for what, 5 years? Thomas swallowed hard. 5 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Martha settled into the chair across from him, her weathered hands folded in her lap. When you were arrested, Sarah vanished. No one knew where she went. Some thought she couldn't face the shame of being associated with a criminal. I wasn't a criminal, Thomas said automatically, the old bitterness rising like bile. I know that. Some of us always knew that. Martha's gaze was steady, compassionate but unflinching. Did you know she was pregnant when she left? The question hit him like a physical blow. No, he whispered, There was no message, no letter, nothing. Martha nodded, as if confirming something to herself. I made another call while you were getting settled. Sarah Keller has been frantic, insisting that her daughter was on that helicopter with her, but the rescue team found no sign of a child. The authorities thought she was confused from her injuries. A concussion, broken arm, hypothermia, the dicrom. Parachute, Thomas murmured, remembering Emily's drawing. She must have put Emily in some kind of emergency parachute before the crash. A mother's desperate attempt to save her child, Martha agreed. It worked, though not quite as intended. The wind must have carried Emily miles from the crash site. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. What do I do now, Martha? If Sarah is... After all this time, Martha's hand on his shoulder was surprisingly strong. You do what's right for that child, Thomas. Everything else is secondary. A soft knock interrupted them. Jack Morrison stood in the doorway, his expression unusually serious. Just got word from Anchorage, he said without preamble. Sarah Keller is being released tomorrow morning. Her brother is flying her straight here in his private plane. They'll arrive by noon. The news settled over Thomas like a physical weight. Tomorrow. After 5 years of silence, of questions, of gradually learned indifference, he would see Sarah again, and she would see him, the man she'd abandoned in his darkest hour, now the savior of the daughter he never knew existed. There's something else, Jack continued, his voice dropping. That environmental research team? They weren't just studying wildlife. They were documenting illegal activities in the Northern Preserve. Poaching, unauthorized construction, timber theft. That's why their helicopter was sabotaged. Thomas straightened. Sabotaged? Not an accident? Jack shook his head grimly. State police just confirmed it. Someone tampered with their fuel line. They're launching a criminal investigation. The implications were clear. Whoever had endangered that helicopter had nearly killed Emily. Had nearly killed Sarah. A protective surge rose in Thomas, surprising him with its intensity. The isolation he'd cultivated for years, the walls he'd built around his heart, they suddenly seemed flimsy in the face of this new reality. I need to talk to her, Thomas said finally. Sarah, before she arrives, she needs to know Emily is safe, that she's here. Martha nodded. Use my satellite phone. The connection's better than yours. 30 minutes later, Thomas stood outside in the biting cold, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to it ring. His heart hammered against his ribs, a caged animal sensing imminent freedom or danger. He wasn't sure which. Hello? The voice that answered was hoarse, exhausted, but unmistakably hers. Sarah, he said, her name feeling both foreign and painfully familiar on his tongue. It's Thomas Grant. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Then a strained whisper. Thomas? Why are you calling? Emily is safe, he said simply. She's with me. A broken sound came through. The line, half sob, half shuddering breath. You found her? You found my daughter? Yes. Thomas paused, the unasked question hanging between them. Our daughter. But he couldn't form the words. She's physically fine, a bit shaken up, and she isn't speaking. But Martha says that's normal. After trauma. Oh God, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you. Sarah's voice broke completely then, dissolving into tears. When she could speak again, her words came in a rush. They didn't believe me. The rescue team, the hospital, they said there was no evidence of a child on board. That I was confused. But I knew she was out there somewhere. I put her in the emergency evacuation pod when I realized we were going down. It has a parachute system. It was all I could think to do. "You saved her life," Thomas said softly. Another pause, heavier this time. "Thomas," Sarah began, her voice tentative. "There's something you need to know about Emily. Something I should have told you years ago." "She's mine," Thomas said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Isn't she?" The silence confirmed it before Sarah's whispered, "Yes," came through. "I was going to tell you, right before everything happened. Then you were arrested, and I was scared, confused. By the time I realized how wrong I was to leave, it seemed too late." Thomas closed his eyes against the swirl of emotions. Anger, grief, joy, betrayal, all colliding within him. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said finally. "Emily needs her mother." As he ended the call, Thomas looked up at the vast Alaskan sky, stars impossibly bright in the clear night air. Somewhere in that immensity, he thought he could detect a pattern, a purpose to the seemingly random suffering of his past years. The wilderness had not just been his refuge, it had been preparing him for this moment, for the discovery of a daughter he never knew he had. Inside the clinic, Emily still slept peacefully. Wolf curled protectively at the foot of her bed. Thomas watched them both, this unlikely family formed, in the midst of disaster, and felt something shift within him. The first stirrings of a thaw after a very long winter. Morning arrived with pearl gray light filtering through frost-covered windows. Thomas had barely slept, his mind racing with the implications of all he'd learned. Emily, however, seemed to have recovered her energy completely, eagerly devouring the pancakes Martha had prepared while making elaborate drawings for Wolf, who watched her with devoted attention. "She's certainly taken to that beast of yours," Martha observed, pouring Thomas another cup of coffee. "Never seen Wolf so gentle with anyone." Thomas nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He found her. Really, I might have missed those tracks if not for him." Martha's knowing gaze lingered on Thomas's face. "Children have a way of changing everything, don't they? Even before you know they're yours." Before Thomas could respond, Jack burst through the door, bringing a blast of cold air with him. "Planes coming in early. Weather front moving in faster than expected. They'll be here in 30 minutes. 30 minutes. The time frame sent a jolt of anxiety through Thomas. He looked down at Emily, who was happily unaware of the impending reunion, focused entirely on her drawing. A crude but recognizable portrait of Thomas and Wolf. "Emily," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "I have some wonderful news. Your mom is coming here today. Very soon, actually." The change in the child was immediate and dramatic. Her eyes widened, the pencil dropped from her hand, and she launched herself into Thomas's arms with such force that he nearly toppled backward. "That's right," he continued, holding her close. "She's okay. She was hurt in the accident, but she's better now, and she's been looking for you." Emily pulled back, her expression serious. She pointed to Thomas, then made a questioning gesture. "Yes, I'll be there too," he assured her, understanding her concern. "I'm not going anywhere." In the distance, the distinctive sound of a small aircraft engine broke the morning stillness. Emily heard it too, her entire body tensing with anticipation. "Let's get your coat on," Thomas said, attempting to sound calmer than he felt. "It's cold outside, and we want to be there when your mom's plane lands." The tiny airstrip at the edge of Fort Krestoff was little more than a cleared stretch of relatively flat ground, but it served its purpose. As Thomas, Emily, and Wolf approached, the single-engine plane was already making its final approach, its skis sending up plumes of snow as it touched down. Emily clutched Thomas's hand with surprising strength, her other arm wrapped around Wolf's thick neck for additional support. Despite her evident excitement, Thomas could sense her apprehension, a feeling he shared in full measure. The plane taxied to a stop. moments that seemed both suspended and racing by. The door opening. A man emerging first, Kevin, Sarah's brother. Thomas recognized him despite the years. Then, a second figure, moving more slowly, one arm in a sling. Sarah. Time seemed to falter as she stepped onto the snow, her face lifting to scan the small, welcoming party. Even at a distance, Thomas could see the moment she spotted Emily. Her body physically lurched forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. "Emily!" The cry carried across the open space, raw with emotion. Beside him, Emily trembled. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, she released Thomas's hand and ran toward her mother, her small legs pumping through the ankle-deep snow. They collided halfway, Sarah dropping to her knees despite her injuries, gathering her daughter in her arms with a desperation that was painful to witness. Their reunion was private in its intensity, despite the audience, mother and daughter locked in an embrace that seemed to exclude the very air around them. Thomas hung back, uncertain of his place in this tableau. Wolf, sensing his hesitation, pressed against his leg in silent support. Finally, Sarah looked up, her tear-streaked face finding Thomas. The years fell away in that gaze, the young woman he'd loved, the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned before it all collapsed. Slowly, she stood, keeping Emily pressed to her side, and walked toward him. Each step seemed to require immense courage from both of them. "Thomas," she said when they were just feet apart, his name carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. "Sarah." He nodded, struggling to keep his voice steady. Emily, apparently sensing the tension, looked between them with concerned eyes. Then, decisively, she reached out and took Thomas's hand, pulling him closer to them, creating a circle where there had been two separate points. Sarah's eyes fell to their joined hands, then rose again to Thomas's face. "She knows," she said, softly. "I've shown her your pictures, told her stories about you, about her father." The word hit Thomas with physical force. Father. A title he'd never expected to claim, never dared to imagine would be his. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the question that had burned in him since the previous night finally escaping. Sarah's face crumpled slightly. "I was going to. That weekend, before everything happened. Then you were arrested and I was alone and scared and everyone said you were guilty." She shook her head, tears forming again. "By the time I realized what a terrible mistake I'd made, you were already in prison, and I was too ashamed, too afraid you'd never forgive me. So you let me believe I had lost everything," Thomas said, the old pain surfacing. "When all along, I had a daughter." Emily, though she couldn't understand the full meaning of their exchange, clearly sensed its importance. She tugged on Sarah's coat, then pointed urgently to Thomas. "She wants us to stop fighting," Sarah translated with a sad smile. "She's right, of course. This isn't about us, Thomas. It's about her." She hesitated, then added, "But for what it's worth, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day." The admission hung in the cold air between them, as fragile and complex as a snowflake. Thomas didn't know how to respond, what to feel. The years of bitterness and isolation warred with the undeniable pull he still felt toward this woman, amplified now by the knowledge of their shared child. Kevin approached cautiously, breaking the moment. "We should get everyone inside. Storms coming in faster than predicted." Indeed, the clear morning had given way to lowering clouds, the temperature dropping noticeably even in the past few minutes. Thomas nodded, professional instincts taking over. "Martha's clinic has room for all of you," he said, defaulting to practicality in the face of emotional complexity. "Emily's been staying there since we arrived yesterday." As they walked toward the settlement, Emily positioned herself deliberately between her parents, reaching up to hold each of their hands. The gesture, so simple and yet so profound, was not lost on either adult. This child, their child, was building bridges they had thought permanently destroyed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical checks, explanations, and cautious conversations. Sarah's injuries were healing well, though the concussion had left her with persistent headaches. Kevin, who had been frantically searching for his niece alongside the official rescue teams, looked nearly as exhausted as his sister. Through it all, Emily remained the center of gravity, her silent presence somehow guiding the adults around her toward reconciliation rather than recrimination. She refused to be separated from either parent, creating situations where Thomas and Sarah had no choice but to interact, to cooperate, to remember what had once existed between them before tragedy and misunderstanding had torn them apart. As evening approached, Martha invited everyone to dinner at her home, the largest in the settlement, and the traditional gathering place for community events. The meal began stiffly, with conversation limited to practicalities and polite inquiries, but gradually warmed as shared concern for Emily created common ground. It was during dessert that Jack Morrison, who had joined them, cleared his throat, significantly. "I got more information about that helicopter sabotage," he announced. "State police are investigating a company called Northern Frontier Enterprises. They've been trying to get development rights in the preserve for years. Luxury hunting lodges, they say, but rumor has it they're more interested in the mineral deposits." Thomas frowned. "That's the same company that was behind the poaching operation I was accused of being part of." "Exactly." Jack nodded grimly. "And guess who's on their board of directors? Richard Harlow." The name sent a chill through the room. Harlow had been the prosecutor's star witness against Thomas, the man whose testimony had sealed his conviction. "They're going to get away with it again," Thomas said bitterly. "Just like last time." "Maybe not," Kevin interjected, speaking up for the first time that evening. Sarah wasn't just taking photos of wildlife up there. She was documenting illegal construction, unauthorized roads, hunting in protected areas. That's why they targeted the helicopter, to destroy the evidence. Sarah nodded, her face grim. "But they didn't know I was backing up everything to a secure cloud server. Every photo, every GPS coordinate, it's all safely stored. Enough to launch a full investigation into Northern Frontier, and potentially re-examine your case, Thomas. Thaiki." Implication was clear. The same people who had framed Thomas 5 years ago had now endangered his daughter and her mother. The circle of injustice was complete, but this time, they had the means to break it. As the adults discussed strategies and evidence, Emily tugged on Thomas's sleeve. She handed him a new drawing, this one showing 3 figures holding hands, in front of a small house that looked suspiciously like his cabin. Above them, she had carefully printed her first written word since her rescue. "My family." Thomas stared at the drawing, then at the hopeful face of his daughter. Despite everything, the years of pain, the betrayal, the loss, he felt something, unexpected bloom in his chest. The possibility of a future he had long ago abandoned. Across the table, Sarah's eyes met his, uncertain but hopeful. Whatever lay ahead, confronting old enemies, healing old wounds, building something new from the ashes of the past, they would face it together, for the sake of the silent child who had brought them back into each other's lives. The storm that had threatened earlier arrived in full force overnight, confining everyone to the settlement for at least the next 48 hours. Thomas found himself grateful for the forced pause, time to process the whirlwind of revelations, to observe Sarah with their daughter, to begin tentatively rebuilding bridges he'd thought permanently burned. Emily's improvement was remarkable. Though she still didn't speak, her eyes were brighter, her gestures more animated. She'd taken to following Thomas around whenever Sarah rested, studying his movements with an intensity that sometimes unnerved him. Was she looking for similarities? Trying to reconcile the father from Sarah's stories with the man before her? On the afternoon of the second day, while Emily napped under Martha's watchful eye, Thomas and Sarah found themselves alone in the community center's small kitchen. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words. "She has your eyes," Sarah said finally, staring into her coffee cup rather than at Thomas. "Everyone always comments on it." Thomas nodded, feeling a strange pride at the observation. "She has your determination, your courage." Sarah looked up, a sad smile touching her lips. "I wasn't very courageous when it mattered most." "Why did you really leave, Sarah?" The question had festered for 5 years. Thomas couldn't hold it back any longer. "Was it because you truly believed I was guilty?" Sarah set down her cup, her hands visibly trembling. "No," she whispered. "Not really. Deep down, I knew you couldn't have done what they claimed. But I was scared, Thomas. 3 months pregnant, suddenly alone, everyone looking at me with pity or suspicion. And then Harlow came to see me." "Harlow?" Thomas straightened. "What did he want?" "He said they had more evidence against you than what was presented in court. Evidence that could put you away for 20 years instead of 5. He said..." Sarah paused, her voice breaking slightly. "He said if I cooperated, kept quiet, didn't make trouble, they'd stick to the lesser charges. If not, they'd make sure you never saw the outside world again." The revelation struck Thomas like a physical blow. "You were being blackmailed. All this time, I thought you'd abandoned me because you believed the worst." "I abandoned you because I was a coward," Sarah said, tears now flowing freely. "I told myself I was protecting our baby, that Emily needed at least one parent who wasn't in prison. But the truth is, I failed you. Failed us both." Before Thomas could respond, the door burst open. Jack Morrison stood there, his expression grave. "We've got trouble," he announced without preamble. "Just got word from my contact in the state police. Northern Frontier's men are headed this way. Someone tipped them off about Sarah being here and they know about the evidence." Thomas was on his feet instantly. "How many? How long?" 3 snowmobiles, heavily armed. 2 hours, maybe less, depending on how they handle the storm. Jack's weathered face was grim. "They're not coming for a friendly chat." Sarah paled. "Emily is safe for now," Thomas finished. "But we need a plan." His mind raced through options, calling on years of wilderness survival instincts. "We can't outrun them in this weather, not with Emily and your injuries." "We fight," Jack said simply, the old hunter's eyes glinting with determination. "This is our home. They don't get to threaten our people." Within minutes, the small community had mobilized. Thomas was impressed but not surprised by their efficiency. Frontier people understood threats, understood the need to stand together. Martha had quickly moved Emily and the other children to the storm cellar beneath the community center, turning it into an impromptu fortress with supplies and communication equipment. Kevin, who had military experience, helped Jack organize the settlement's hunters and trappers, only 7 in total, but all skilled marksmen familiar with the terrain. Sarah, despite Thomas's concerns about her injuries, insisted on setting up a communications hub with her satellite equipment. "The evidence is our best weapon," she argued. "If something happens to us, I need to make sure it reaches the right people." As the preparations continued, Thomas found himself drawn to the window, staring out at the swirling snow that both hindered their attackers and limited their own options. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of seeking isolation, of pushing away human connection, he now stood ready to defend not just himself, but a community, a family. An hour later, they heard the first distant whine of snowmobile engines. Thomas positioned himself near the northern approach, Wolf at his side. The loyal animal sensed the tension, his ears alert, body coiled for action. "Never thought I'd be fighting alongside you, Grant," came a gruff voice. Thomas turned to see an unexpected figure approach, Mike Tanner, a local trapper who had once testified against him at his trial. Guess I owe you an apology for believing Harlow's lies." Thomas studied the older man's face, finding genuine remorse there. "Water under the bridge," he said finally. "Right now, we protect our own." The approaching snowmobiles became visible through the snow. 3 machines, as Jack had predicted, each carrying 2 men. They stopped just outside the settlement perimeter, engines idling. "They're waiting for something," Thomas murmured, raising his binoculars. As if in answer to his observation, a 4th snowmobile appeared, this one more powerful than the others, carrying a single rider. Even through the snow, Thomas recognized the arrogant posture, the expensive cold-weather gear. Richard Harlow had come personally to ensure the job was done. Sarah Keller. Harlow's voice carried across the settlement through what must have been a megaphone. "We know you're in there. All we want is the evidence. Hand over the photos and the memory cards and no one gets hurt." Jack snorted derisively from his position. "Yeah, right, and I'm Santa Claus." Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder and turned, to find Sarah behind him, her face set with determination. "I have a plan," she whispered, "but I need your help." As she explained, Thomas felt a mixture of pride and fear. It was risky, but it might just work. It hinged on one crucial fact. Harlow and his men didn't know that Thomas was here, didn't know that he was the one who had rescued Emily, didn't know about their connection. 10 minutes later, Sarah stepped out onto the porch of the community center, alone, and apparently unarmed. Thomas watched from his hidden position, every muscle tense, Wolf equally still beside him. "Mr. Harlow," Sarah called, her voice remarkably steady. "I have what you want, but I need assurances." Harlow revved his snowmobile, moving slightly closer. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate, Ms. Keller. Your interference has become extremely inconvenient." "Before you do anything rash," Sarah continued, "you should know that I've already uploaded all the evidence to multiple secure servers. If anything happens to me or anyone in this settlement, it automatically goes to the FBI, the Environmental Protection Agency, and 7 major news outlets." Thomas could see Harlow's hesitation even from a distance. The man was calculating, always, analyzing risk versus reward. "However," Sarah added, "I'm willing to provide you with access to delete those files, in exchange for written confession of your crimes, including the framing of Thomas Grant 5 years ago." The mention of Thomas's name caused a visible reaction in Harlow. Grant is ancient history. He served his time, disappeared into the wilderness. He's irrelevant. Is he? Sarah gestured toward the trees where Thomas was hidden. "Why don't you ask him yourself?" On cue, Thomas stepped into view, rifle held loosely but purposefully at his side, Wolf stalking beside him like a shadow made flesh. The shock on Harlow's face was everything they had hoped for. A moment of genuine fear, of realization that his carefully constructed schemes were unraveling. "Hello, Richard," Thomas called, his voice carrying across the open space. "Surprised to see me?" The distraction worked exactly as planned. While Harlow's attention was fixed on Thomas, Jack and his people had quietly surrounded the other men, emerging from the swirling snow like wraiths, weapons raised. "Drop your weapons," Jack commanded. "All of you, now." For a tense moment, it seemed the standoff might erupt into violence. Then, one of Harlow's men, clearly a hired gun rather than a true believer, slowly lowered his rifle. The others followed suit, sensing the shift in advantage. Only Harlow remained defiant, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," came a new voice, "I think we do." Kevin emerged from the community center, holding a satellite phone. "Just got off the call with the state police commissioner. Turns out, when you're the son of a senator, people take your calls." He smiled grimly at Harlow. "They're very interested in the evidence my sister has collected, and they're dispatching a helicopter as we speak." Harlow's face contorted with rage. his hand completing its journey to his pocket and emerging with a pistol. "You think I'll let you ruin everything? After all these years?" Everything happened in a blur. Harlow raising his weapon toward Sarah. Thomas lunging forward, Wolf a streak of motion crossing the snow. The gun discharged, the sound shockingly loud in the winter stillness. But the bullet went wild as Wolf crashed into Harlow, bringing him down into the snow with savage efficiency. Thomas reached them seconds later, kicking the gun away and restraining Harlow, whose arrogance had dissolved into panic. "Call off your dog," he pleaded. "For God's sake!" "He's not a dog," Thomas replied calmly, signaling Wolf to stand down nonetheless. "He's family, something you wouldn't understand." The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. Despite the storm, the state police helicopter arrived by nightfall, taking Harlow and his men into custody. The evidence Sarah had gathered was formally documented. Statements were taken, and promises made about reopening Thomas's case. Throughout it all, Emily remained the center of concern for both Thomas and Sarah. When the danger had passed, they found her in the storm cellar, not frightened as they had feared, but calmly drawing pictures for the younger children, Wolf maintaining his protective vigil beside her. As they prepared to leave the next morning, the storm finally clearing, Martha pulled Thomas aside. "What happens now?" she asked, nodding toward Sarah and Emily, who were saying their goodbyes to the other children. Thomas watched them, his heart full of emotions he was only beginning to untangle. "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "We haven't had much chance to talk about the future." Martha's wise eyes studied him. "That child needs both her parents, Thomas, and from what I've seen, her parents might need each other too, if they can find a way past the hurt." Before Thomas could respond, Emily bounded over, tugging insistently at his hand. She pointed emphatically toward his cabin on the distant mountainside, visible now in the clear morning light. "I think she's telling us where she wants to go," Sarah said softly, joining them. "If that's okay with you?" Thomas looked between them. The woman he had once loved more than life itself, and the daughter he was only beginning to know. Something that had been frozen within him for 5 long years began, tentatively, to thaw. "Yes," he said simply. "Let's go home." The cabin that had once felt spacious to Thomas now seemed almost comically small, with 3 humans and a large dog sharing the space. Yet there was a rightness to the crowded quarters that surprised him. Emily's drawings taped to the refrigerator, Sarah's camera equipment sharing space with his weather instruments, Wolf adapting to his reduced bed space with good-natured tolerance. In the days that followed their return to the cabin, they established a tentative routine. Thomas continued his ranger duties, often taking Emily with him on shorter patrols. Sarah documented the wilderness with her camera, both for pleasure and to complete the environmental impact study that had been interrupted by the helicopter crash. But beneath the surface of this newfound domesticity lay Emily's ongoing silence, a concern that grew rather than diminished as the immediate dangers passed. During the crisis, her mutism had seemed understandable, even protective. Now, as safety and stability returned, her continued inability or unwillingness to speak weighed heavily on her parents. "The doctors in Anchorage said there's nothing physically wrong," Sarah confided one evening after Emily had gone to bed. "No damage to her vocal cords, no neurological issues. It's psychological, a response to trauma." Thomas nodded, watching the flames dance in the wood stove. "She's been through so much. The separation from you, the helicopter crash, being alone in the snow." He hesitated. "And before that, growing up without knowing her father." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Thomas. I showed her your pictures, told her stories about you. But it wasn't the same. I thought I was protecting her, but maybe I was just protecting myself from facing what I'd done." "We can't change the past," Thomas said gently. "But we're here now, together. Maybe that's what she needs to heal. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, nearly 2 weeks after their return to the cabin. Thomas was teaching Emily how to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow near the cabin, a daily lesson they both enjoyed. He'd noticed her particular fascination with wolf prints and had been explaining how wolves communicate within their packs. "See how this print is deeper on one side?" he pointed out. "That tells us the wolf was turning, probably responding to a signal from the pack leader." Emily nodded, her eyes bright with interest. She pointed to Wolf, who was nosing through the snow nearby, then made a questioning gesture. "Yes, Wolf would do the same if he were with a pack," Thomas explained. "But he's chosen us as his pack now. That's why he protects you so fiercely. You're part of his family." Emily considered this seriously, then pointed to Thomas, to herself, and made a circular motion that encompassed the cabin where Sarah was working. "That's right," Thomas smiled. "We're all a pack now, a family." Emily seemed to come to a decision then. She took a deep breath, her small face scrunched with concentration, and Wolf, sensing something important, trotted over to sit attentively beside her. "Daddy," she said, the word barely audible but unmistakable. Thomas froze, certain he had imagined it. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "Daddy?" Emily repeated, louder this time, her voice rusty from disuse but gaining strength. "You're my daddy." Thomas felt his knees weaken, and he knelt in the snow to be at her eye level. "Yes," he managed, his vision blurring with tears. "I am." Emily launched herself into his arms with the same decisive energy she brought to everything. "I knew," she whispered against his neck. "Mommy showed me pictures. Said you couldn't be with us, but you loved me." Thomas held her tight, his heart so full it felt like it might shatter. "I would have been with you if I'd known," he promised. "Every day." "I know," Emily said with the simple confidence of a child. "That's why I had to find you." "Find me?" Thomas pulled back slightly to look at her face. Emily nodded solemnly. "When the helicopter was falling, Mommy put me in the special seat with the parachute. She said to stay where I landed, but then I saw wolf tracks. I remembered Mommy's stories about you living with wolves in the forest, so I followed them. I knew they'd take me to you. The coincidence, or fate, of Wolf finding her tracks, of all the possible paths they might have taken that day, left Thomas speechless. "Why didn't you talk before?" he asked gently. Emily looked down, her fingers twisting together. "I was scared. If I talked, it might not be real. You might go away again." "Oh, Emily." Thomas gathered her close again. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." When they returned to the cabin, Emily walking between Thomas and Wolf, Sarah met them at the door, concern evident in her face. "You've been gone a while. I was getting worried." "Mommy," Emily interrupted, her voice small but clear. "I found Daddy, just like I wanted." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock and joy. "Emily, you're talking." The reunion that followed was tearful and joyous. Emily suddenly bubbling with words, as if making up for all the silent months. She spoke of her fear during the helicopter crash, her determination to find the father she'd only known through stories, her belief that Wolf had been sent specifically to guide her. That night, after Emily had finally exhausted herself and fallen asleep, Sarah found Thomas sitting on the porch, gazing at the star-filled sky despite the cold. "She waited for you," Sarah said softly, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she joined him. "All this time, she was waiting until she found you to speak again. The child psychologist in Anchorage said it might happen that way. That sometimes selective mutism is a child's way of controlling a situation when everything else feels out of control." Thomas nodded, still processing the day's miracle. "She said she knew who I was, that she followed the wolf tracks because she remembered your stories about me living with wolves. Sarah smiled sadly. I might have romanticized your ranger life, a bit in my stories. Made you sound like some mythic wilderness figure. I wanted her to be proud of you, to understand why you weren't with us. Why did you really come to Alaska, Sarah? Thomas asked suddenly. Of all the places you could have gone for your photography career, why here? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I told myself it was for the environmental study, for my career. But truthfully, I think I was looking for you, or at least trying to understand the world you'd chosen. After prison, I needed to see it for myself. And now I understand, she said simply. This place, it heals something in the soul. It's harsh, but honest. Like you always were. They sat in companionable silence, the unspoken question of their future hanging between them. They were connected irrevocably through Emily, but whether they could rebuild what had been broken remained uncertain. Inside the cabin, Emily slept, peacefully for the first time since the accident, Wolf guarding her door, her voice restored, and her family, however unconventional, finally complete. Spring came to the Alaskan wilderness, not with the gentle unfurling of flowers, but with the dramatic cracking of lake ice and the sudden, almost violent return of migrating birds. Thomas watched the transformation from the porch of his cabin, no longer his alone, but theirs, with a sense of wonder that mirrored his own internal thaw. The man who had chosen isolation as armor, who had cultivated bitterness as a companion, was gradually giving way to someone new. Or perhaps, Thomas sometimes thought during his quieter moments of self-reflection, someone he had always been beneath the layers of hurt and betrayal. Emily was the catalyst for much of this change. Her resilience, her capacity for joy despite all she had endured, humbled him daily. She had adapted to cabin life with remarkable ease, turning the Spartan dwelling into a home with her artwork. Her collections of interesting stones and feathers, her endless questions about the wilderness Thomas had come to know so intimately. "Why does the fox's tail have a white tip, Daddy?" she would ask during their daily nature walks. "So its pack members can follow it through deep snow or dense undergrowth," he'd explain, marveling at how easily the word Daddy now flowed between them, as if the 5-year gap in their relationship had somehow been compressed into insignificance. Sarah's presence was more complicated. They circled each other carefully in the small space, their shared history both binding them together and keeping them at arm's length. The legal proceedings against Harlow and Northern Frontier had required multiple trips to Anchorage, leaving little time for personal resolution. Yet Thomas found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. The determined set of her jaw as she edited photographs, the gentle way she braided Emily's hair each morning, the quiet competence with which she had adapted to the challenges of wilderness living. The woman who had abandoned him was still there, but so was someone stronger, more thoughtful, tempered by years of single motherhood and professional struggles. The turning point came unexpectedly, during what had begun as a routine patrol of the eastern boundary. Reports of increased bear activity had prompted Thomas to investigate, and Sarah had asked to accompany him to photograph the seasonal awakening of the forest. Emily remained at Martha's clinic in the settlement, enjoying a rare playdate with other children. They had hiked in comfortable silence for most of the morning, stopping occasionally for Sarah to capture particularly striking vistas or signs of wildlife. The easy rhythm reminded Thomas of their early days together, before careers and ambitions had pulled them in different directions. "Remember that camping trip to Yellowstone?" Sarah asked suddenly, as if reading his thoughts. "When we got caught in that thunderstorm and had to shelter under that tiny rock overhang for 6 hours?" Thomas couldn't help but smile at the memory. "You were furious because your camera got soaked. And you told me it was the universe's way of telling me to experience the moment instead of always trying to capture it." Sarah laughed softly. "I was so mad at you for being right." The shared memory hung between them, a fragile bridge across the years of separation. Thomas found himself wanting to cross it, despite the risk. "I used to think about those moments a lot," he admitted. "In prison. The good memories kept me sane. Until they became too painful," Sarah finished for him. "I understand. For a long time, I couldn't look at our old photos. Couldn't tell Emily too much about you without breaking down." They crested a small ridge, and Thomas stopped abruptly, signaling for silence. Below them, in a small clearing beside a partially thawed stream, stood a mother grizzly with 2 cubs, their first venture out of the den after the long winter. Sarah carefully raised her camera, capturing the tender scene as the mother showed her young how to overturn rocks in search of early spring food sources. The moment was perfect, life continuing its ancient cycles despite human dramas and complications. As they watched, one of the cubs wandered too close to the stream's edge. The mother immediately nudged it back to safety with a gentleness that belied her enormous strength. "Nature always finds a way to protect what matters," Thomas murmured. Sarah lowered her camera, her eyes finding his. "Yes," she said simply. "It does." The charged moment was interrupted by a sudden crackling from Thomas's radio. Jack's voice came through, tense with urgency. "Thomas, do you copy? We've got a situation at the North Ridge. Forest fire, moving fast with the wind. Settlements on alert. How's your position?" Thomas immediately checked their surroundings, his ranger training taking over. From their elevated position, he could now see a faint haze of smoke in the distance. "We're about 3 miles east of the cabin," he responded. "No immediate danger, but we'll head back now. What's the source?" "Lightning strike, looks like," Jack replied. "Unless it was those poachers we chased off last week. Hard to tell. Either way, it's growing fast." Thomas and Sarah exchanged concerned glances. Though forest fires were a natural part of the ecosystem, this early in the spring, with snow still on the ground in shadowed areas, suggested human involvement. "Emily?" Sarah asked urgently. "She's fine," Jack assured them. "Martha's keeping all the kids at the clinic, but we could use Thomas's expertise on containment strategy." They made the journey back to the cabin in half the time it had taken to hike out, the smell of smoke growing stronger with each mile. By the time they reached the clearing where the cabin stood, they could see the orange glow beyond the northern ridge, smoke billowing into the otherwise clear sky. "I need to get to the settlement," Thomas said, already gathering his emergency firefighting gear. "You should stay here. The cabin is in a defensible position if the wind shifts." Sarah shook her head firmly. "I'm coming with you. Emily needs both of us." The settlement was in organized chaos when they arrived, residents implementing the wildfire response plan they rehearsed each spring. Children and elders had been moved to the community center's reinforced basement, while able-bodied adults created fire breaks or packed valuables in case evacuation became necessary. Martha met them at the clinic, Emily immediately running into Sarah's arms. "Mommy, Daddy, Jack says there's a fire, but not to worry because the grown-ups will fix it." Thomas knelt to her level, his voice calm and reassuring. "That's right, sweetheart. And I'm going to help them. I need you to stay with Mommy and Martha, okay?" Emily nodded solemnly, then surprised him by reaching into her pocket. "I made this for you," she said, pressing a small object into his palm. "For protection." It was a crude bracelet woven from colorful threads, with a single small wolf charm, clearly one of her treasured possessions, tied into the center. "Thank you," Thomas said, his throat tight with emotion as he slipped it onto his wrist. "This will keep me safe for sure." As Thomas joined Jack and the firefighting team, Sarah caught his arm. "Be careful," she said, her eyes reflecting the distant flames. "We just found each other again, all of us." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that Thomas understood completely. "I will," he promised. "Some things are worth protecting at all costs." The fire burned for 3 days, consuming nearly 2,000 acres of forest, before a combination of natural fire breaks, strategic backburning, and finally, Merciful rain brought it under control. Thomas worked alongside the settlement's volunteers and the forestry service teams that arrived on the second day, his intimate knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable in predicting the fire's behavior. During a brief rest period, while checking equipment at the command post, Thomas was approached by a state police investigator who had arrived with the emergency response team. "Ranger Grant? I'm Detective Winters. Got a minute?" Thomas nodded tiredly, accepting the offered cup of coffee. "We found something interesting at one of the fire's ignition points," the detective continued, pulling out his tablet. Trail camera caught these guys about 20 minutes before the blaze started. The image showed 3 men in hunting gear, one clearly recognizable as a lower-level executive from Northern Frontier who had avoided arrest during the earlier operation. "Doesn't prove they started it," Thomas observed, "but it's suspicious timing." "Gets better." Winters swiped to another image. "This was in their vehicle when we detained them at the roadblock. Thought you might recognize it." Thomas found himself looking at a frayed magazine cover, a nature publication from 6 years ago, featuring one of his photographs. The same magazine whose editor had testified against him, claiming Thomas had provided inside information about protected species locations to poachers. "Harlow's singing like a canary since his arrest," Winters explained. "Trying to cut a deal. Says this whole operation goes back years, including your wrongful conviction. Apparently, you were getting too close to exposing their activities back. So they set you up to take the fall." Thomas stared at the image, the final piece of a puzzle that had defined 5 years of his life falling into place. "Will it be enough to clear my name officially?" Winters nodded. "Between this, Harlow's testimony, and the evidence your Ms. Keller provided, the prosecutor's office is already preparing the paperwork for your full exoneration. There'll be a formal announcement next week." The news should have felt more momentous, Thomas thought later as he made his way back to the firefighters' camp. Instead, it seemed almost anticlimactic. The official recognition of what he had always known to be true. Far more significant was what awaited him at the settlement. A small girl with his eyes and her mother's determination, and perhaps the chance to rebuild what had once been lost. When the fire was finally declared contained, Thomas returned to the settlement, exhausted but satisfied. He found Sarah and Emily helping distribute supplies to families who had been displaced from outlying cabins, Wolf assisting in his own way by providing comfort to frightened children. Emily spotted him first, breaking away from her task to run into his arms. "You're all smoky," she declared, wrinkling her nose even as she hugged him tightly. "But you still have my bracelet." "It protected me, just like you said," Thomas assured her, holding up his wrist where the handmade token remained, securely fastened despite 3 days of grueling work. Over Emily's head, his eyes met Sarah's. Something had shifted between them during this crisis, the careful distance they had maintained, dissolving in the face of shared purpose and concern. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, they sat together on the settlement clinic's porch, too exhausted to make the journey back to the cabin but too wired to sleep. "Detective Winters told me about the exoneration," Sarah said quietly. "How does it feel?" Thomas considered the question. "Strange," he admitted. "For so long, clearing my name was everything. Now it seems important, but not essential. Not compared to this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the sleeping settlement, the cabin on the distant hillside, and by extension the small family they were cautiously forming. Sarah nodded, understanding. "When the helicopter was going down, I had this moment of perfect clarity. Nothing mattered except Emily. Not my career, not the past. Nothing. I think sometimes we need to lose everything to understand what's truly valuable." "And what's valuable to you now?" Thomas asked, the question he'd been afraid to voice for weeks finally emerging. Sarah turned to face him fully, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen since before their separation. "This," she said simply. "Us. A second chance, if you think that's possible." Thomas looked at the woman before him, not the idealized memory he had alternatively cherished and resented during his years of isolation, but the real, complex person who had made mistakes, as he had, who had suffered and grown, and found her way back to him through extraordinary circumstances. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes the wilderness gives us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it." He reached for her hand, the gesture both a question and an answer, when her fingers intertwined with his. The transformation that had begun with finding a half-frozen child in the snow seemed to complete itself, not erasing the man he had been, but integrating that solitary, wounded soul into someone more whole, more connected, more alive. The wilderness that had been his refuge would now be their home, a place of healing, of new beginnings, of family forged through fire and ice. 1 year later, the cabin that had once been Thomas's solitary retreat was almost unrecognizable. An additional room had been built onto the eastern side, large windows capturing the morning light that Emily insisted was essential for her growing collection of houseplants. A small greenhouse attached to the southern wall housed Sarah's experimental garden, an ongoing battle against the short growing season that she approached with characteristic determination. Where there had once been a single chair on the porch, there now stood 3, one sized for Emily, plus Wolf's customized bed that Thomas had built when the loyal animal developed a preference for watching the sunrise alongside his human pack. The interior had undergone an even more dramatic transformation. Emily's artwork covered nearly every available wall space, charting her emotional recovery through increasingly confident and joyful expressions. Sarah's photographs were more selectively displayed, professional works intermingled with family moments. Thomas teaching Emily to fish in the stream behind the cabin, Wolf patiently allowing Emily to adorn his fur with wildflowers. The 3, humans and 1 canine, gathered around a campfire under the northern lights. Most significant, however, was the small building that now stood 50 yards from the main cabin. A research center and educational outpost that combined Thomas's wildlife protection work with Sarah's environmental documentation. What had begun as a personal project had evolved into an officially sanctioned program, funded by a conservation grant and supported by the Forestry Service. Visitors, mostly scientists and students, occasionally tourists with a genuine interest in preservation, came during the brief summer months to learn about the delicate ecosystem Thomas had dedicated his life to protecting. Sarah's photographs, alongside her powerful written narratives about the threats facing the wilderness, had brought national attention to the region's conservation needs. Emily, now nearly 7, had appointed herself assistant ranger, solemnly leading visitors along carefully marked trails, identifying plants and animal tracks with precocious expertise. Her once silent nature had been replaced by an almost constant stream of observations and questions, as if making up for the months of imposed quiet. On this particular morning, the anniversary of the day Thomas had found Emily in the snow, the family stood together at that very spot, now marked with a simple cairn of stones. It looked different with all the snow, Emily observed, trying to reconcile her fragmented memories with the summer landscape before them. "Everything looks different in winter," Thomas agreed, his arm around Sarah's waist. "The land hides itself under white, waiting for spring, like people sometimes," Sarah added softly. "We hide our true selves until it's safe to emerge again." Emily considered this with the seriousness she brought to all philosophical discussions. At 6, going on 7, she had developed a wisdom beyond her years, a consequence perhaps of her extraordinary experiences. "Wolf never hides who he is," she declared finally, scratching behind the ears of her faithful companion. "That's why he found me when I was lost. He always knows the truth." Thomas and Sarah exchanged smiles over their daughter's head. Her simplistic assessment contained more insight than she realized. The directness of nature, its honesty and lack of pretense, had indeed been the saving grace for all of them. Later that evening, as Emily slept soundly after the day's adventures, Thomas and Sarah sat on their expanded porch, watching the summer stars emerge in the still light sky. "I received another offer from National Geographic today," Sarah mentioned, her tone deliberately casual. "A 6-month assignment documenting climate change impacts across the Arctic Circle." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. Despite their remote location, Sarah's career had flourished over the past year, her unique perspective on wilderness conservation in high demand. "When would it start?" "That's the thing," she said, turning to face him. "They want all 3 of us. Your expertise in wildlife management, my photography, and they even suggested educational content featuring Emily. Properly supervised, of course, and only if we're comfortable with it." Thomas was silent for a moment, considering the proposal. A year ago, the thought of leaving his sanctuary, of exposing their hard-won peace to the outside world, would have been unthinkable. Now, he found himself intrigued rather than threatened by the possibility. "What do you think?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Sarah's smile held both excitement and contentment, the expression of someone who had found her center. "I think we've healed enough to carry home with us wherever we go. This place saved us, but we're not hiding anymore." Thomas reached for her hand, the simple gold band on her finger catching the last rays of the setting sun. Their wedding 3 months ago had been a small affair, just the settlement residents, Martha officiating, Emily proudly carrying the rings attached to Wolf's collar. A family formed against all odds, through chance encounters and deliberate choices, through forgiveness and second chances. "Then I think," he said, echoing words spoken a year before, "that the wilderness has given us exactly what we needed, and now it's giving us permission to carry its lessons into the wider world." As if in confirmation, a wolf howled in the distance, a lone voice soon joined by others, the pack responding to the call. Wolf lifted his head from his porch bed, ears perked toward his wild cousins, but made no move to join them. He had chosen his pack, just as they had chosen each other. Inside, the cabin. Emily stirred in her sleep, dreaming perhaps of snow and rescue, of family found and family made. Outside, beneath the endless Alaskan sky, Thomas and Sarah remained on the porch until the stars fully emerged, planning their next adventure with the quiet confidence of those who had survived the harshest winter and emerged stronger for it. 3 years later, a 9-year-old Emily would receive her first professional camera, a joint gift from both parents, acknowledging her inheritance of Sarah's artistic eye and Thomas's patient observation. Her first photograph, proudly displayed in their cabin no matter where their conservation work took them, would be of Wolf and his unlikely friend, a wild female who occasionally visited from the neighboring forest. Thomas's story teaches us that sometimes our greatest wounds become our most profound sources of healing. His journey from isolation to connection reminds us that even in our darkest moments, redemption waits just beyond the horizon. What wilderness are you facing in your own life right now? What painful experiences have caused you to build walls around your heart? Perhaps like Thomas, you're being called to risk opening yourself to connection again. Have you ever considered that your greatest pain might be preparing you for your most important purpose? Thomas's years of isolation gave him the skills he needed to save Emily, the very daughter he didn't know existed. What if your struggles are similarly preparing you for something meaningful beyond your imagination? The most powerful choice Thomas made wasn't rescuing Emily from the snow. It was choosing to trust again after betrayal, to forgive after abandonment, to believe in family after loss. What choice do you need to make today to begin your own journey toward healing? Life rarely gives us perfect circumstances, but it always gives us the chance to respond with courage. Thomas didn't wait for perfect conditions to build a new life. He started with a half-frozen child in a blizzard and created something beautiful from there. What first step could you take today, imperfect as it might be? If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need this message of hope and redemption. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to continue your journey with another emotional story that might just change how you see the world around you. Remember, sometimes what looks like the end of everything you've known is actually the beginning of everything you're meant to become.